about whatever I'm going to kind of go over. So in terms of the material for today, the plan today is to go over the recycler view control and how do we use that, how do we incorporate that into our applications. The end goal of that is we're going to use the recycler view anytime we need to show a list of things or anything that resembles a list of things efficiently. So that can be something that's an array list. It can be something that's any other kind of list. It can be something that's actually an array. It could be data that comes from the database. It could be data that's coming from the network, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at, say, pretty much any social media platform, you'll notice that there's some interesting challenges when we're working with the scale of data that you see in, say, a social media platform, where you have thousands and thousands of records that you're trying to show on screen, and you need to show that efficiently on a mobile device. So, for instance, if you go to your home feed on Twitter, you'll know that you can, there's tons of stuff there. You can keep scrolling, right? And you can keep scrolling, and there's going to be more stuff there. It would be really inefficient if we use the naive approach to show things like that, to show things like the Twitter home feed or Facebook's home feed or et cetera, the list goes on. So pretty much anywhere where you see a list these days in Android, you're going to see a recycler view. Like that is the thing we use. So this is a really, really common sort of control. Where does this fit in with the projects that we've been working with? Well, with the NPR, that newsreader, obviously I'm going to use those RecyclerView to render the stories. In your case, it would be to render the search results from the eBay. From eBay. Those would be where you would show the products. So it's going to factor into both of those sides. Okay? So general objectives, again, we're going to use this to show a list. We're going to talk about how do we incorporate and do an example with incorporating that recycler view into our activity layout. And basically the short answer of what we're going to do is we're going to replace what we've been so far outputting as a text view. We're just going to replace that output with a recycler view instead. Okay. We'll talk a little bit about, along the way, we need to talk a little bit about how do we work with array lists, because you maybe have done a little bit with it, but we haven't had a chance to really talk about array lists. And in that case, maybe we need to talk a little bit about generics, because generics are also relevant to this process as well. We're going to look at how to implement subclasses of two things, the Viewholder as well as the adapter. I will mention briefly that the way I develop those subclasses and implement them is different than what is in the reading material, than what is both in the textbook, because the textbook has one variation, and if you look at the online article for RecyclerView, Android developers, they have a different sort of example, and I really do it a third way. And part of that is kind of an outflow of having done this for many years. I've found some things that work and some things that don't work, and some things that work well and some things that don't work well. So the way I implement my RecyclerView and my adapter and my viewholders is a little bit different, and we can talk about why that is. But the way I approach that is a little bit different. We also need to look at how do we implement things like on-click events, how do we respond to when the user interacts with that recycler view, because that's a common need. Once you've got something displayed in the list, the user needs to do something with that list. And usually that's, for instance, let's say on the newsreader, that would be click on a story and it takes you to the actual story itself. Or in your case, it may be click on the item and it goes to the actual listing on eBay. So there are things like that you may want to do in response to different user interactions. And then we also at the end, one of the things in here we need to talk about is there's really three options today that exist kind of for showing a list of things or showing a scrollable list. We've already looked at scroll view. We've already been using scroll view, and so that's one option sometimes. There's also the list view class, which we really don't use anymore. It's been completely superseded by the recycler view. It used to be one way of showing a list of things. And then there's also the recycler view, which we're going to talk about today. So there's really three approaches out there right now for showing lists of things, and they are slightly different, and they have some pros and cons. Cool. So that's kind of the quick overview. So pulling from the reading assignment, you should have seen this definition. So let's talk about what a recycler view is and what problem is it trying to solve. So RecyclerView makes it easy to efficiently display large sets of data, specifically so large sets of data. Actually, it's even really efficient for small sets of data. It's worth mentioning that large sets of data already starts in the hundreds, right? If you've got 100 records, that's already a large set of data. If it's anything that doesn't fit all on one screen, for all intents and purposes, it's a large set of data. The only case where you might not need some of the functionality here is if all of the data fits on one screen, which is very rare, very, very rare. So most applications benefit from this, even if the data set is relatively small, because you get the benefits very fast. So you supply the data and define how each item looks, and then the recycler view is going to dynamically create the elements for it. So the process is we get the data, we use our processes, whether we're getting them from the network, we're getting from the database, whether we're getting them just from stuff we have in memory or a file, the data can come from anywhere. Long story short, we just need to get it into some sort of sequence. RecyclerView doesn't even say that it has to be a list. It could be an array, it could be a list, it could be a database cursor, it could be a stream, an IO stream, it could be anything. It doesn't really matter in the RecyclerView world. You can take anything that represents a sequence. It does have to have an order, like that is important. You do have to know what the first, second, and third item is. You have to have an order to it. But as long as it's a thing that has an order, you can render it in a RecyclerView. So that's an important distinction, is that it doesn't necessarily have to be a list, and it won't always be a list. But oftentimes it will. Okay. As the name implies, the RecyclerView recycles the individual elements. Those are the views and the display components that we're actually using to render the items. As the user scrolls down, scrolls up or down, as things go off the screen, what it does, rather than maybe throwing away that data, maybe throwing away those views, it will reuse them for a new item that's coming on screen. So you scroll down, items go off the screen, it will then use those views for the new item that's coming on the screen as you're scrolling down, and vice versa for up. So it's dynamically, maybe you're only at any given time seeing 5 items, it will reuse the views for those 5 items. So that means you can show a list of 1,000 things, but it only ever has to render 5 of them. Only ever has to render the 5 of them that are on screen. It's worth mentioning it does show a few before what's on the screen and what's after the screen. It does usually have another 2 or 3 that are kind of on the edges, so they're ready before it gets scrolled in. So you might have maybe 3 on screen, 2 on the beginning, and 2 on the end, and it will dynamically figure out how many items it needs based on the size of the recycler view and based on the size of the items. So you don't actually have to worry about how big is that pool. All we do is produce that pool, and then it will reuse that pool. So that's kind of the idea. The whole point is to reuse things as it's scrolling up and down. That means, again, we're only rendering those. We're only rendering a few things. It also means the traditional approach with the list view was actually with a list view, everything in the list, if you have 1,000 things, everything was shown all the time. With the list view, everything was shown all the time, regardless if it was on the screen or not, which meant that, okay, I want to render 1,000 things. Well, maybe each thing needs 5 views. Well, I need 5,000 views to render that list, and they're always in memory, and they're always in use as long as that list is available. That's a huge difference from saying, okay, I only need to render the 5 that are on screen. That's 25 views instead of 5,000. It's a huge, huge difference. So that's what we're trying to get to, right? That's that efficiency we're trying to get to. This is one of those things that really, if you're building mobile apps, I don't care what technology you're building in, this is kind of a trick that you want to use regardless of the technology, the underlying technique. In fact, this is something that if you kind of understand how it operates, actually it's something you can use with React, right? It's something you can take and go, okay, I can incorporate and kind of build my own recycler view in the world of React because it's worth doing it, right? If you think about the world of, Twitter's got an online page, well, obviously that main page isn't an Android app. They don't have a recycler view, so they're having to build those things in tools like React. So this is a little bit broader. This kind of idea behind this is a little bit broader than just talking about the Android world. But Android's one of the few technologies that kind of has a built-in implementation for this. So, so the whole idea is to really save on performance, both in terms of what we have to render, because we have to render a lot less. We have to keep a lot fewer things in memory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Battery consumption, power consumption. So if you look at the chapter 4.5, let me go to F11 and get this into full screen. There's a picture here that I pulled from your textbook, which does a decent job of kind of diagramming and looking at what this normally looks like. So here in the middle, you can see the items, and it kind of looks maybe a little bit like Gmail, because Gmail's using this recycler view. So you've got your list of items. Each item is represented as a card. You've got those ones that are visible. You've got a few before it that are kind of in queue up top. You've got a few down at the bottom that are in queue, and maybe a few that it's kept on the side just in case, right? So those are the only views that's really keeping it going. Is just the ones, those boxes that you see there. The general process of how we do this kind of looks like so. We start with the data. So in this case, maybe the data is a list of words, a list of strings. We start with that data over here. We're going to then use something called an adapter to translate that into the views. And in that process, we'll have each item is kind of connected to something called a Viewholder. So Viewholder is kind of a container for a set of views, represents a single item. And then from there, that's going to be, this adapter is what's connected to the recycler view, right? And so this is what the user actually sees. The user sees the recycler view. Our data is over here, maybe in a list, but the adapter in the middle is the part that the adapter and the Viewholder is kind of what makes it work, right? It is the connecting and the binding glue between the front end and the back end, okay? In here, you can see wordless item. That would be where the views are rendered, kind of holds the item. There's also something in here we have to mess with as well called the layout manager. Layout manager is what controls how those items are displayed. And so basically you can render them linearly, vertically, horizontally, or you can render them in a grid. There's a little bit more to it than that, but that's largely what the layout manager is. Okay, so there's a few different key classes that we'll be using to build this list up. So we've got the RecyclerView class. Within the RecyclerView class, there are actually two nested classes, RecyclerView.Viewholder and RecyclerView.Adapter. Both of those classes will be implementing our own subclasses up. Okay. Also in there, there's a few different layout managers that we can choose from. So we can choose from a linear layout manager, we can choose with a grid layout manager, or what's called a staggered grid layout manager. Staggered grid layout manager is more akin to something you might see if you use, what's the Pinterest? Pinterest, if you've seen, is kind of that staggered view. That's what that's that kind of layout, that grid layout would be that staggered view. And then we also need to use event listeners. I think I meant to move that over to the other side. I thought I did. So those are the classes that you have to use, right? That's the basics. You have to start with at least 4 classes just to get going. In addition to that, we also often use this in concert with array list and live data and event listeners as well, such as Oncreate. So oftentimes those classes will be used with this as well, even though they're not strictly required, if that makes sense. So there's usually quite a few classes involved in making this work. So there's a few steps that we need to go through as far as how do we get things, how do we actually implement and use this RecyclerView. So if we're going to use the RecyclerView, the first thing we have to do is we have to add it to the layout. Okay, that's the starting point for almost everything that we've done. You start by adding it to your activities layout. From there, we also have to design a secondary layout which represents the items. So we'll have one layout for the activity, and then we'll have another layout that represents each item within that activity. Now, previously, one of the things that I've done is I've created a separate layout for the scroll view. Okay, remember, so we've kind of already gotten that experience of putting two layouts into each other. Okay, difference here is we don't use that include tag to do this process, so we won't be using that there. Another distinction I might mention, generally we don't use scroll view and recycler view together. It's usually one or the other. The reason being, you don't want in your app to have 2 different things scrolling it vertically. And that's the problem that you get if you use both, right? So let's say the whole screen has a scroll view. Well, you can scroll that, and then you also have a recycler view that's part of the screen. Well, then when the user swipes up and down, well, which thing scrolls? I don't know. Really depends. And generally speaking, the system doesn't know. So we have to use one or the other. So when I do the example here, I'm actually going to get rid of the scroll view. I will not have a scroll view. I will only have a recycler view. That's one distinction. Cool? So scroll view is good if you're trying to scroll the entire screen or some part of the screen, but specifically here, we're going to just be scrolling the recycler view part. Occasionally, you will see some of those things nested. So for instance, if you were to look at Netflix, you would see that they've got their main page. You can scroll up and down and get different categories. And then you can also scroll horizontally, right, within those categories. The way that that sort of is set up is actually there are a set of nested recycler views. The whole page is a recycler view, the part you're scrolling up and down, and then each of those categories is a horizontal recycler view. So you're actually seeing, if you're seeing 3 different categories, there's actually 4 different recycler views on screen. The three categories that are horizontally and the main page, which is vertical. So we do oftentimes combine those in more complex layouts, but we're starting with something simple. Another place you might see that if you say, hey, you're doing the eBay thing and you want to have multiple pictures per product. What you oftentimes might do is the products themselves are in a recycler view, and then for the images, you might have a horizontal recycler view to go through the images for that product. So again, these things can sometimes be nested, okay, where you might have one vertically and one horizontally. So we'll also need to, so once we've designed those 2 layouts for the activity and for the items, we need to implement a subclass of the Viewholder. That subclass of Viewholder will be based on how we've designed the item layout. So the item layout will influence what we put into that Viewholder. Next step is we need to make a subclass of the adapter. That adapter is what's going to bind together the data with the Viewholder and make all that stuff to work. Once we've done that, we can have to then go back to the activity and make some code modifications. So in the activity, we have to tell it what layout manager to use. We have to find the recycler view and then assign a layout manager to it. And we also have to create an adapter and assign the adapter to that recycler view. Next thing, we typically find ourselves passing data. We'll have to look at how we pass data to populate the list. And then we oftentimes will add in, at that point, we might play around with live data and maybe use that to observe the live data and update the list based on when it changes. So for instance, if you've got data coming back from the database or API, etc., you may want to have it automatically update based on events there. And then we also want to look at how do we respond to events, how do we hook up event listeners like on-click listeners, etc. So that's kind of the process that I want to walk through of how to use this. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go to, you did a lab for Unit 2 where you built this movie list. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to implement that using a RecyclerView. And so in that process, we can both review some of the things from that lab and see how I would implement those things, as well as just see how to do the RecyclerView. Benefit of me doing it that way is we can start from the clean slate rather than starting immediately and jumping into what does this mean in the larger frame of things. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. Time allowing, I might look at how to do the NPR News app. Otherwise, we'll stop there because that should also potentially be enough to just figure out what you're doing here. Okay, so that's the plan. So I'm going to start a new app in Android Studio. I'm going to get out of the full screen here. I would ask that you just take notes and not try to code along, because I do want to move through this at a relatively rapid pace. I'll make the code for this available after lecture so you can get the finished project, but I would ask for the moment to just take notes. All right. First things first, I need to create a new project. I'm going to start as usual. I'm going to start that from the empty activity. And let me put that under, I want to put that under my public repository. Let's call this movie list. Movie list, that's all good. All right, I'm going to go ahead and hit finish. How's the lighting situation here? Would it be better with that strip of lights off, or is it good?
It's both fine.
Okay. So just starting with an empty process. Empty project. So, as I usually do, I'm going to start with the layout for the activity. I do want to say this, tell this to always add. We do a rebuild to try and force this to update the preview. There it goes. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the hello world that's in there. Delete it. Okay. So in terms of what I'm trying to build, I'm trying to have, hey, here's a list of movies that maybe are your favorite movies or whatever. You're tracking a list of items. I'm just going to store those as a simple list of strings. Okay. I need a place for the user to add some more movies. So I'm going to start with adding that part at the top. So maybe I'm going to add just a plain text here where they can type the movie in. I'm going to add, let me maybe switch over to the blueprint view. I'm going to add a button here. I'm not sure why is that adding constraints. I want it to be adding constraints right now. And I want to set that default to 8. So I want an input box. I want a button to add. I also want a text view where I can show error messages. Say if the user leaves the field blank, then I want to have some way to show the user and tell the user that there's a problem, right? So I'm going to also put a text view in there for that as well. Next up, I need to add in the recycler view itself. You can notice under common, this is one place you'll find the recycler view because it is a very common element. I believe you can also find it under containers as well. So you can find it either under containers or common. All right, I'm going to drag that in. And I'm going to start adding some, giving those names. So let's see. So we've got the movie title input. Yep, refactor. I've got the add button. Yes. I've got the error text. I'm going to show errors there. And then this would be the actual movie list. And now I'm going to anchor these things to the edges. So maybe I start with the top and work my way down. So I'm going to anchor that to the top left corner. I'm going to anchor this to the top right corner. I want to anchor the text view maybe underneath the input, left, right, anchor this up here, and to the 4 edges. Now one gotcha, I typically find the best thing to do with laying out a recycler view is typically I want to have that extend all the way to the edge of the screen. So typically around a recycler view or a scroll view like this, where I'm kind of putting it in within the layout, I typically want that scroll bar to be all the way on the edge. So I'm actually going to set all sides of this to a margin of 0. I also need to set their width and height. So I'm going to set this to match constraint and match constraint. So the recycler view is going to take up any remaining space. Now I think I do need to add a little bit of margin on the top to give it space from the error text. The error text I need to span to match constraint for the width, but I do want some margin there on the left and right. In terms of getting this title, I want to get the title to expand, so I'm going to connect it here, and then I'll also set it to match constraints to start with that layout. Questions? That kind of makes sense. Pretty simple layout. So I've got a text view for errors, I've got a button to do something, to button to add things, and a button in the input box as well as that. Actually, probably here, while I'm thinking about it, I should probably use an image button to make this take up a little bit less space, right? Because if I think about what's there for add, maybe I'd rather that just be an icon. So I'm going to go ahead and change that real quick while I'm thinking about it. So here, back to this being wrap content, get rid of that constraint a bit, bring it back in. So let me do an image button instead. Buttons. Image button. Oh, and I need an icon before I can do that. So I'm going to go under drawable, add a new icon. So a new vector asset. I'm going to look for add. So there's a nice little plus icon there I can use. So I'm going to go ahead and add that. I'm going to call that IC add. Next. Finish. Alright, and now I can add that image button. Yes, I do want to add that too. Source control. Did it? Oh, no. Okay, so add is my icon, and I'm going to anchor that to the top right again, and back to doing what I did here. So just switching that over to there. So this needs to be that add button. I need to name it again. And maybe rearrange things a little bit so that that's back in the order that I have. So the only difference really there is I wanted to have a little plus icon instead of having the text there. Also worth noting on here, I need to change the default text that's in there, so I don't want it to start out saying name. I want to remove that. I might want to have some sort of placeholder, so I might go down to put in a hint. So I might say enter movie title ... as a hint here. I might say let's just do some designer text. This is the error. So that's the error that's going to appear here. I might want to change the color of that text. So if I go in here, I can change that. And maybe I'll do Charlie Charlie instead of full red. Go ahead and change that there. So I can, it's worth mentioning, I can hard code the color there if I want to. I usually find it better to export that resource. So actually, just as you can do with strings, you can actually go over to the code here, select that color, do Alt-Enter, and extract the color resource, and I can make that my error color. So just like you can extract strings, I can extract those colors. Another thing I want to do real quick is just increase the font size of both of those things. So I think I want, say, maybe 20 SP for my error message, and I think 20 SP for my inputs, just to make that a little bit bigger. Okay, so let's start with that. If I run the application, we can see what we have so far. So here we've got what the application looks like right now. You might notice in the preview that when you see RecyclerView in the preview, it lists it as item 0, item 1, etc. That's, remember, the preview is not always the same as what appears when we run the application. So out of the box, a RecyclerView is completely empty, right? If we start with a RecyclerView and we don't do anything, there won't be any data shown. So there's some process, there's some things we have to wire up to actually get the data there in the first place. Okay. Do pay attention to all those steps because oftentimes when we're doing this, I usually have students that they get to the end of the process and they say, I don't have any data showing up. My RecyclerView is empty. It's usually because you missed one step along the way. It's usually because you've either forgotten to give it a layout manager or it's because you've forgotten to give it an adapter. If you forget either of those two things, this is what you'll get. If you forget the layout manager or the adapter, you'll get this. Okay, so that's my layout. Let's go back to the, why is this in red? Oh, no speakable text. One thing I try to pay attention to is what the errors are. So one thing you might notice here on the add button, because it's an image button, notice how it says there's no speakable text. Well, because there's only an icon. So from an accessibility perspective, right, there's nothing, it doesn't know what to call that, how to read that. So what I need to do is give it some sort of explanation, some sort of textual explanation of what that button does. So I'm going to go over to the split view on the image button. If I remember right, the way to do that is just to add a content description. So content description is just going to tell it, here's how to describe it when the screen reader is reading it. Okay, so I'm just going to put in the text add, And that way it's there from accessibility rather than having to actually put that text on the UI. So I also need to extract that because that is now readable and needs to be translated. So this may be the add button. Go ahead and extract it as that. You'll also notice on the placeholder that I need to extract that as well. So this would be, what did I call that? Movie title. Title hint. Okay. So I'm going to extract that there. It does say the touch target is too small. So one thing, this is kind of a new check that you'll see sometimes about the touch target being too small. It didn't used to warn about this. So actually some of the default sizes of things like edit text and buttons are sometimes too small out of the box. So in order to fix that, you actually have to make them bigger. So the way I've done that with the input is I increased the font size to 20 SP. That gets it up to the 50. I think it's actually checking for 48, but 50 is kind of the point I'm going for, 50 by 50. So all I need to do is get the image up to the button up to that size. So what I'm going to set is a minimum width of 50 dp and a minimum height of 50 dp. So that's going to ensure that that button is at least 50 dp by 50 dp. That's going to get rid of that here. Also mentions autofill. So maybe I need to go here and go Alt Enter, and we're going to tell it that this is just not important for autofill because I'm looking at a search input. I'm also going to say that the input type is just text because I don't need it to suggest person names. I just want it to be text. So that's going to fix those. There's still some complaints here about text color and contrast. I'm not going to worry about those here. That's really kind of a topic for another day when we talk about theming. But they're saying that the contrast between those two things is not sufficient. Although what I might be able to do is go quickly to the design and just change the tint of that button to one of our purples. Maybe I'll do the blue. Yeah, that's a little bit better. Okay, so let's talk about the next part of that. So I've got a layout for the activity. From there, I need to add another layout, which is going to be for the individual items, right? So I'm trying to render those. I'm going to say new layout resource file. Okay. So a little word on convention. You might notice anytime we create a new project, the name of that layout is activity_main. Everybody see that? Activity_main is that normal name. The way it actually works, if we were going to add, say, another activity, if I called that second activity, then the default name for that layout would be activity_second. So anytime we have a layout for an activity, by convention, we start that with activity_. And that sorts it in there because they're sorted alphabetically to kind of put all of the activity layouts together. Okay? So on a same kind of note, we oftentimes want all of our item layouts, the things that are being rendered inside of a recycler view, to also be kind of alphabetically arranged as well. So the convention that I follow is activities start with activity_. Items, item layouts, the things I put in Recyclerviews, I start them with item_. Right? So you'll see as your project gets larger, that you have a lot of layouts that start with activity_, and a lot of layouts that start with item_. Okay? So I'm going to call this item_. What? What is the thing that I'm showing in this list? Is it a string? Yes, but does that matter? Not really, right? What I want to name it out as not so much the data type of the thing that we're rendering, but what that thing actually is, right? So the thing I'm actually rendering is a movie, even though I'm going to be storing those just as an array of strings. So I'm going to call it item movie. In your case, for your project, you're rendering a list of item summaries. So I would expect that to be item summary, you know. So item movie, and I'm going to just simply add that here, keep it as a constraint layout, add. All right. So one little gotcha with this layout is that this layout is not going to occupy the entire screen. Okay. Unlike your activity layouts and other things where they do occupy the entire screen, this is not going to occupy the entire screen. And there's some gotchas there, right? Well, I'm going to not fix that right now, but we're going to see if I leave things alone, there's going to be a bug. It's going to try and render this item as big as the end screen. Okay, we'll make it happen. We'll take a look at it, and I'll show you how to fix that. Okay, so in terms of how I render the movie, for my case, I might want to say, let's just add a simple text view and nothing else, right? So I'm not going to have any images. I'm not going to have any other pieces of data. For this, I'm just rendering one string. With your example, I expect you to have more things. So I'm expecting you to have things with, say, the title of the product, maybe the price of the product, the seller, is it new or used, etc. And definitely reserve a place for the image because we'll be talking about how to do that tomorrow. Okay, so first things first is I'm going to add that text view, and this is going to be, I'm going to call this item underscore movie underscore title. So I'm kind of prefixing the name of the layout to the beginning of that ID. All right, I need to anchor that to the top and left, and I also want to anchor that to the right, set it to match constraint, and maybe I'm going to set all of these to 0. Because rather than using margins here, I actually want to use some padding. So back to the split layout, Android, layout padding. So I'm going to put some padding on this text view. Make that 8 dp. That's should bring it in a little bit. And what am I missing? Padding. Oh, just padding, not layout padding. Okay, 8 dp. So that's going to bring that in. So you'll notice here that I've intentionally only anchored it in on the top 3 corners. That's important. So I'm letting the height be flexible, but the width is fixed to the entire width of the screen. That's important. So if you're rendering a recycler view in the vertical orientation, you're rendering it from top to bottom, you want to make sure that the width is match constraint effectively. You want to stretch it as wide as the space is. We need to make sure effectively the height of it is wrap content. Okay. It's flipped. If we were doing a horizontal layout, it would actually be the backwards. So if we're doing a horizontal recycler view, we'd want the height to be match constraint because we fix it to the height of the recycler view versus the width would be wrap content. So you're always going to find one side is basically match constraint and the other side is wrap content. Everybody got me there? But it depends on which orientation you're doing it in. Okay, so in terms of what I want to put in here for text, I don't actually want any text to start out initially. So I might do tools, text, movie, title, in all caps. Okay, So that's my simple layout, okay, in terms of what we want to do here. It is a constraint layout I have here, so I can really do whatever I want, just like you can design a layout, just like you can design an activity. You have all those same tools here in this item layout as well, okay? All right, so that's our layout. So step one, remember, was to make the activity layout. Step two was to make the item layout, okay? The next step, so if I look at my series of steps from here, next step I need to do is implement the Viewholder class, okay? So here's kind of a quick example of what that might look like. It needs to be a subclass of the RecyclerView.Viewholder. Okay, so it's going to be a subclass that's going to extend that. The way I name that is typically based on what I'm representing. So if I was representing a product, I would call it Product Viewholder. If it was a movie, it would be a Movie Viewholder. If it was an item summary, it would be Item Summary Viewholder. So take the name of whatever the data class is, add the word Viewholder. That's the convention for that name. Within there, I will add the views that make up that item layout. So in this case, I'm only going to have one text view because for the movie title, because that's all I have in there. But you might have oftentimes more things. So let's say I want to represent the title of a product, the price of the product, the seller of the product, and the image. I would add all of those here. Okay. So notice I'm giving the name of them. I've got their type, and I marked all of them public. Okay. This is different than what you might have seen in the reading material. They marked all of them private. Why do I mark them public? Long story short, the encapsulation doesn't matter. That's why. Because typically the kind of historical convention is you make all your instance variables private, and then you add getters. Well, it turns out for this purpose, if you're writing a Viewholder, that's just way more code than you need to write, because the only thing that has access to your Viewholders is actually your RecyclerView. So that encapsulation actually gives you nothing. It's just a bunch of extra unnecessary code. So that's why I go ahead and just make these things public, because the extra work of writing getters isn't really necessary, especially since that process there isn't really, I'm not really accomplishing anything, because I would end up adding a getter and a setter for every single piece. I do have to have a constructor. So here I've got a constructor, same name as the class, Product Viewholder, so it's Product Viewholder. This is going to be, for me, it's going to be Movie Viewholder, because I'm working with movies. I want to make that constructor public. Little gotcha, remember this is a subclass. The parent class does have a constructor that takes one argument, which is the view, and basically that is the parent of the item. So that item view that I'm receiving is the parent that contains all of the items. In my case, that's actually going to be the constraint layout, because that's the root of my item layout. Okay, so I actually know that this view specifically is going to be constraint layout, but I'm not down past it too. Okay, so we do have to write a constructor there, which just takes the item and immediately passes it down. Okay. Another little distinction you might notice in here, if you looked at the example code, they did find view by ID within this constructor. I don't recommend doing that because it really puts the responsibility in the wrong place. Doing that is okay if you only have one variation of your product layout, but oftentimes you will have more than one. So you might have, for instance, an administrator sort of layout for your items versus a user or consumer layout. That makes that harder to do. It actually makes it harder if you put more code into that constructor. So I actually take that responsibility away from the Viewholder. All it is just a simple container, and I'm going to put the rest of that responsibility in the adapter. So that's one of those things that I found over time, is it makes more sense for me to put more responsibility into the adapter and less responsibility into the Viewholder. also one thing that lets me do that as well. Sometimes I may want to have a list of things that is a list of their summaries, or another thing that's a list of their full details, or two different lists that represent the same sort of thing. If I do it this way, I can reuse the Viewholder. If I do it the way that's in the reading material, I can't reuse the Viewholder. I end up finding myself writing multiple copies of the same Viewholder because they're slightly different, because the ID of the item in this item layout is one thing and the ID of the thing is something else. Okay, so this is the way I want you to write the Viewholders, rather than what's in the reading material. Okay, so I'm going to go implement that now. All right, going up to my code, I haven't added any packages yet, so I'm going to go ahead and add 2 packages. New package. I'm going to add a data package, and I'm going to add a UI package to kind of preserve those layouts that, or those layers that we talked about on Friday for the application architecture. Now, both the Viewholder and the adapter are technically directly connected to the UI, so they're both considered like UI level layer classes. So that's where both of these will land. So under the UI, I'm going to add a new Java class. This is going to be the movie Viewholder. Okay, movie Viewholder. I'm going to add that in. I'm going to say that this extends RecyclerView dot Viewholder. I'm going to do Alt-Enter to import that. Oh, I need to spell it right. There we go. That's the one I want. Okay. Oh, and it screwed it up on me again. There it is. Okay, so RecyclerView. All right, so that's a subclass of not RecyclerView, but a subclass of Viewholder, which is inside of RecyclerView. If order holds Control and to go to kind of click on the code to go to the definition of it, what you would find is that it's a static class inside of RecyclerView.java. So it's a nested static class, which is why I have to spell it out as that name. That's why you see the dot in there, is because it's nested inside of the RecyclerView class. Okay, so let's add in what we need. So remember, I'm going to mark these public. I only have a single text view in my layout, so I'm just going to have a single text view here. So text view, this is going to be the title, and I'm going to add a constructor public movie Viewholder view item view super. So super just calls the parent constructor, and I'm going to pass in that item view. Okay, that's all my code. That's all my code for the Viewholder. So it's pretty simple, right? I'm keeping that pretty lean. All I really care about is making a subclass of Viewholder and just adding a field, adding an instance variable for each of the different views that are going to be on there. Okay. Next thing is to create the adapter. Okay, so I'm going to show you an example before I code it out to kind of what this might normally look like. There are some distinctions here that I've gone ahead and added, and one of those things isn't really obvious, and I haven't put all the code in here, so it may not make sense yet, but notice I have a reference to some context. Okay, that's a give and take. If I can avoid the context, I would, but I've found more often than not, actually I think I missed something in here too, because I should have that layout in later. I found out more often than not I end up needing a reference to the activity within my adapter. Okay, that's something if you can avoid, you should, but it takes quite a bit of an engineering hurdle to get away from not having a reference to the activity in the adapter itself. Okay. So often turns out you need to do certain things that need a reference to the adapter, need a reference to the activity. So I'm going ahead and getting that construction. So in my constructor for the adapter, I'm taking the context as well as the list. Okay. So I take the context, that activity, plus the list, save those both to those instance variables. You'll see that this is a subclass of RecyclerView.adapter. Notice the little greater than and less than sign part of it. That's because the adapter is actually a generic class. It takes an argument there, which is what type of view holder are you using. So there I have to supply product view holder because this is my product list adapter, right? So I have to say what kind of view holder am I using. That inherently means you can't write the adapter until you've written the view holder. You have to do them in that order. It is possible to engineer it in such a way where you can actually nest the view holder inside of the adapter, and sometimes that's helpful. I would recommend just keeping them as two separate classes, and that makes it easier to kind of do the view holder. So, starting from there, there are three methods that we have to implement on the adapter. There's three abstract methods. The first one is getItemCount. The second one is Oncreateviewholder. And the third one is onBindViewholder. Anytime we're implementing an adapter, we have to implement those three methods. Please implement them in that order. Please implement them in that order. The code examples all do them alphabetically, but I really would prefer to see them in this order. There's a reason for that, and that reason is that they get called in that order. That's the sequence of events that it goes through, the system goes through when it's using your adapter. So the first step method you have to implement is called getItemCount. All this does is it says how many things total is this adapter showing, right? Does it contain it there? And basically that's typically just the size or the length of your array or your list of some sort, right? It's just how many things are there, okay? That can be as simple as array.length. It can be as simple as list.size, okay? So I can say here just one little mark of note. If you're working with an array with the square brackets, the way you get the length of that is .length, versus if you're ever working with a list, it's always .size. They're called two different things. I wish it was called length, but that's the convention in Java. Anything that's a subclass of collection, it's size. So also noted here, I'm doing something pretty important. I'm checking if it's null. That's a common oversight. If you forget to check that it's null, and it is actually null, your application will crash as soon as it tries to render the RecyclerView, which is not the friendliest thing to debug. The error message when that crashes is not very obvious about why did it crash. It doesn't really lead you back. So I do this in all of the adapters I create to avoid that, because I also often find out one other way that you can try to work around that is sometimes if you say, hey, I don't have a list, or the list is null, I don't have the search results yet, sometimes people will work around this by just creating an empty list. But I find out more often than not, I will usually accidentally miss someplace where it could be null. And so, I really don't want this to crash. So this is a quick fix to make sure that it doesn't crash. I say, okay, let's check if it's not null. If it's not null, we use the size. If it's null, well, just return 0. The benefit of doing that, one of the benefits of doing that, if you say that there's no elements, both of the other two functions just don't get called. Because, oh, I don't have anything to view, I don't need any view holders. Does that make sense? So by doing the check here, I don't have to also worry about checking for null in either of the two other functions because they won't get called. Cool. Okay, next up, Oncreateviewholder. So remember what we're doing. We're trying to show a list of items. Each of those items will be effectively kind of represented by a view holder, but I'm only creating as many view holders as I need, right? So if there's only 5 items on screen, I might only create like 7 or 9 view holders, right? I won't create a view holder for everything that's on screen. Okay, and typically also these view holders only get created earlier in your process in the startup of your application. From there on out, it will keep reusing those same view holders as long as you use the same adapter. If you create a brand new adapter, throw the adapter away and create a new adapter, then all of the view holders have to be recreated. But as long as you're keeping the same adapter, you get to reuse those view holders. Okay, so this is one common misconception is the Oncreateviewholder is called once for every item in your list. That won't happen. It just is going to be created a few times. So it receives a view group and a view type. It returns a view holder. That has to be the signature. From there, the first thing we have to do is use a layout inflator. Notice the reference to context. I have to inflate that layout that I defined before. So like here it's inflating the product layout. I have to pass in that view group. That view group is actually basically the layout manager, layout management view group. So let's say we're using a linear layout manager. That will be that. And then false, that last thing is a flag that changes how things behave. And basically, if I remember it, false says don't immediately add it to that view group versus true says add it immediately to that view group. If you put true there, your application will crash. If you put true there, your application will crash. That does have to be false in this thing. And that just has to do with how the Recyclerview works and how the layout manager works. Okay. So we create this base, right? So we take the layout, the item layout, inflate it. That gives us back a view. So that view is basically the root element in our layout. So remember, my root is a constraint layout. So that's going to be a constraint layout. From there, I'm going to create a new product view holder, passing in that item view, passing in that range. And then start assigning those properties. So I say viewholder.title is equal to item view, find view by find view by find view by view. So I'm doing this logic here. I'm saying go through each of the things that I know are in that layout and go ahead and save them to the view holder. So one of the things I mentioned, the code examples that you see online do this in the view holder, but I do it over in the adapter. The part of that I've kind of talked about already. One of the reasons though here, notice that this is the place that determines what layout we're using. So it really makes sense and is really helpful for it to be both determining the layout and determining the IDs, because those things are correlated, right? If you have a different layout, all of those IDs change. So those things really, it's really helpful to have both of those in the same place. Cool. That way, if I need to swap out the layout, I only have one place to go. And then last thing to do, which is the easy thing to forget, is you need to return the view holder. If you forget to return the view holder, this won't compile because it has to return the view holder. Cool? Okay. So that, notice that just produces a view holder and populates the view holder. Notice some things that are missing from that method. So in Oncreateviewholder, I don't bind it to any data. I don't have data yet. I don't know what item that it will be displaying. I'm just setting the view holder up. Okay, I'm just setting it up so that it can be reused. But I'm not actually changing any of the properties of those views yet. Okay, so all of the actual changes to the views happen over in OnBindViewholder. OnBindViewholder is when it finally decides, okay, I want to show this item with this view holder. Take this view holder and put the data into it. Okay? So we create the view holder, then we bind the data to it. Recognize that this view holder that you get is the first argument. So you get view holder and position. That view holder may be one that you just created. It may have been just produced by Oncreateviewholder. It might be one you're recycling as well. Okay? It might be a new one. It might be a recycled one. A common mistake here in onBind is assume that it's new. Assume that it's clean. Right? The reality is you don't know what the state of that view holder is at this point. So assume that it's dirty. Assume that every property, all of the text in there is not what you expect it to be. So that means all of the text views, you need to call set text on. Don't assume that there are what you put in the design, because you might have recycled them. Okay. If you're going to set the color on anything, you need to set the color every time, because you don't know if something previously set the color to red or green or whatever it may be. So you've got to make sure that you're treating this as something that has been potentially recycled. Cool. So here I'm just saying, hey, let's set the text. We'll set it to maybe the title of the item. We'll set the price. We'll set the seller. We'll set the image. And here I'm just setting it to some placeholder. So in this example, I'm not actually loading the image yet. We'll talk about that process tomorrow. But I'm going to start with just a placeholder image in there to begin with. Cool. So that's kind of what our things start with, and this is the example that I kind of want you to go off of as you're building your lab. Okay, because it's going to look more like that. This is a simplified example. Okay, so first things first. Let's create that adapter. So again, it's going to be in the UI layer. I'm going to create a new Java class. This is going to be the movie list adapter. Yep. And this extends RecyclerView .adapter. And you'll notice in there as I was kind of writing that .adapter, you kind of see the uppercase VH at the end. Okay. Sometimes you'll see that in the IntelliSense. Remember that the less than or greater than means that this is generic, and VH is kind of the name of that type, short for Viewholder. Okay. So in terms of that, I need to put in my movie Viewholder. Boop. Okay. Instance variables, private, activity, context. So I know that there has to be an activity where this is being rendered, and I also need the data itself, right? So the data is going to be a list of strings. One thing worth mentioning here, notice that I'm intentionally using list. Okay, in the Java world, there is the array list, which is what we typically use. It's an implementation of list that is backed by an array. Internally, there's an array. List, though, is this generic interface. There's actually a few different kinds of list. So a list is anything that behaves like a list. Okay, so an array list is one thing that behaves like a list. So examples of list include linked list, include array list, include some versions of, I think you could even get a hash map, a linked hash map in there. There's all sorts of different things that could be, right? Anything that behaves like a list. Because in here, I don't really care that it's an array list. I just care that it's a list. Does that make sense? I only care that it behaves like a list. I don't actually care that it's an array list. So that's why I'm not specifying that here. That makes this more reusable if I change my mind later about what kind of list this is. So public movie list adapter, I'm going to create my constructor. I need to take in both of those things. the context, the activity. Activity is the context. I need the list of strings. Okay, items. If this was, say, products, then that would be like list products. If I had a movie object, then it would be list movie. But I'm just keeping track of only these movies as having titles. Okay, so next up, in here, I need to say this dot context is equal to context. This dot items is equal to items. Okay, so that's my starting point. That's my instance variables and my constructor. Yes?
So if it was product, would you define that within the movie list adapter, or within that, or where would that be defined?
So if I needed to define a movie, I would go up to data, and it would be somewhere defined in the data layer. So for instance here, if I needed a movie object, I would go up here and create a movie class. And so it might look something like public string title. So I create something like that, and that would be my movie class. If I needed to have more bits of data, and maybe I should go ahead and do that. Maybe I should go ahead and use that movie class here. So maybe I iterate this a little bit, and I say, hey, this is a list of movies, and then that would just appear here. But yeah, the movie would be part of the data layer versus where the adapter and the view holder are part of the UI layer. Okay, so everybody remember what the first method in here that I need to override is? What's the first method I need to override? We just looked at a code example. Huh?
Something about count.
Something about count. Get item count. So a quick way to get there is I type in get item count. As soon as you type that in, it will start the name of the method. It will start giving you a nice drop down. So that's all I do. I just start typing in the name. I'll pick it from here, and it will go ahead and give me the correct signature. So that's how I do the overrides, is I just start typing in the name. Notice there that I intentionally skipped over, say, public int. The best way to get that is actually just going straight to the name, rather than if I write public int and it doesn't do as good for the IntelliSense. So in here, we'll remember that I need to return the size of that list, and commonly, the simplest version of that is this, but that breaks as soon as you have nulls in there. And so that's where I enhanced it a little bit, and I said, okay, well, let's check if it's null. Items is not null. Then I'll ask for the size, and otherwise just use 0. Again, avoiding it from crashing. What's my next method? Okay, so let's try typing that out. And it pops up here on Oncreateviewholder. So I'm going to go use that. And it'll start filling in that signature for me. In fact, it'll put the right type here because notice that that has to be the particular viewholder subclass that we defined up in the top. Okay, all right. So in here, I need to use the layout inflator. So let's say I want to do layout inflator. And I forgot to do it on the example, but there's one thing I usually do to try and save a little bit of bandwidth. So from the layout inflator, I'm going to go ahead and say inflate. There I need to pass in the ID of the layout, r.id, r.layout, dot, what am I missing from there? r.layout. So is it not seeing my item movie? Has it not picked it up that it's there yet? Maybe not. View group and false. Oh, because I haven't imported R yet. That's why. I need to do Alt Enter and bring in R. Oh, and this is parent. Okay, so parent there. I need to save that. What's returned? View item view is equal to there. Boop, boop. Part of the reason that I broke that into 2 lines is first of all, the line's long, and it actually turns out that you can reuse this part. It actually turns out because the only thing that inflator depends on is the context, I can actually make that an instance variable, and I usually do to save a little bandwidth. I think that this used to be done in the example code on that page, but I think it's been updated, been changed. But I usually find myself doing it in the constructor. This dot layout inflator is equal to yada yada. That way I can reuse the layout inflator every time. The other way works. This is just a little bit faster in terms of being able to, again, reuse that inflator without having to ask for it multiple times. Next up is we need to actually create the Viewholder. You might notice there when I autofilled that it automatically added in the return null at the end. Be careful about that, because if you leave that null in, it will crash if you leave that return null. So I might as well, just to be safe, go ahead and remove it. So in here I need to say movie Viewholder VH is equal to new movie Viewholder, pass in that item view, and then get each of the elements one by one. There. And so vh.title is equal to item view dot find view by ID, r.id dot what do we have? We have the item movie title. There. Cool. That's what I want. And then the last step is return VH. So in terms of if I only have a single view to update, it's as simple as that. If I only have a single view to get from the layout, there'd just be one line there. Next up, remember, is on bind Viewholder. So we're going to fill that in the same way. First thing I want to do is get the particular item from that list. So I'm going to say we've got item, these are movies. So movie item is equal to items.get. Now notice if you're working with an array, if I'm working with the array, the way I typically index things is I would do items like so with the square brackets. Okay, that only, however, works with arrays. Arrays are the only thing that you can actually use those brackets with. Okay, not array list, not list. That only works with arrays. Okay, so what I have here is not an array. Okay, so in order to get something from a list, you have to use the method get, and so we say get I. Why is that? Well, it actually comes back to the same story that's happening up here with size. So as it turns out, with an array, that length is exposed as a property, but Java doesn't really have this idea of properties, not like C# has, right? So actually it needs to be a method, it needs to be a function. So because Java doesn't have properties, they have to use a method instead. If Java had used properties, then it would be like it is in C#, where it's list.length. But because there's no properties in Java, that's why it's list.size. Same thing here. Java does not provide a way to override the indexer, override what that what that square bracket is. So therefore, it's only implemented for arrays. Classes can't decide what happens with it. Java, C# does have that functionality. So in C#, that's why you see if you're working with a list, it's still that same syntax. But because there's no indexer support in Java, it's that syntax. Yes.
So do lists, do they not have indexes, or?
They don't have what's called an indexer. So C# provides something called an indexer. It allows you to basically define a pair of methods, a getter and a setter, for when the user asks for an element. So I can say when the user wants to, in C#, I can say, let's get index. I can put some logic in there, and I have a setter. Actually, I think it's similar to that. I think my syntax is slightly off, but it's roughly like this. It gives you basically get a getter where you can define what the code is, and then you can return a value from here, and you have another setter where you say, okay, I get the index and the value on the setter, and you can write that there. Java just doesn't have that. It actually turns out that JavaScript also has that now. JavaScript does have a way to define indexers, which is a recent addition, and it's actually very similar to how it works in C#. But they don't have this in Java, which is also kind of weird because C# does have it, or C++ had this, which came before. It's one of those things that Java actually removed. All of the overload in C++, you can basically overload any operator you want and make it behave the way you want it to work. You can't do that in Java. Anything that would require operator overload has still not been supported in Java. They took that away. They said that was problematic, and it hasn't been added back in, even after so many years. So that's why things with working with lists are weird, is because we don't have operator overload, because we took that out. Because they took that out. So that's the gotcha. One quick thing to mention, I think I did see this on one lab. Please don't do this. It's not that it's invalid syntax. The problem is it's extremely inefficient. So if we say toArray makes a copy of the entire list and then gives you that back. Okay, well that does mean you're working with an array at that point, but it means that you've just made a copy. That copy is not cheap. That copy is not cheap. If I'm copying an array of 1,000 things, I've just copied that entire array. In the context of like this, that will make your whole system freeze. If you try to call toArray with a large list in the context of say onBind view, you're going to see the animation stutter because it costs that much. So that's just one gotcha. Is make sure that you're not using toArray there. Similar thing I saw, toArray.length. Please avoid using toArray. Okay, I think the reason why it wasn't working there is because I think toArray is probably just on array list and not list. So anyway, all right, so I've got the item, and I then need to stuff that data into the Viewholder. So VH, remember VH holds all of the views. So in this case, it holds one text view for the, it's called holder up here. Let me change that. vh.title.setText, and I'm going to set it to the item.title. So basically, I take the data out of the item and I stuff it into the views. right? This is the binding part, right? This is the part where we actually update the views to show the data. Cool. So you got kind of a three-stage process. The good news is like the whole recycling part, most of that you don't have to deal with, right? The only part that we have in the recycling is to implement these two methods and to just make sure in here that we're assuming that the Viewholder could be recycled. But we don't actually have to deal with all of the other stuff that comes with the RecyclerView of determining, does it go off screen, is it on screen, and doing that process. That part's dealt with us. Okay, so where we at in this stages? So I've created my adapter. So the next thing I need to do is set up the layout manager. Okay, so the layout manager I'm going to set up in the activity. I've got 3 different layout managers that I can choose from. I can choose from a linear layout manager, which is a linear layout. I can either I can do that horizontally or I can do it vertically. Here I'm going to do a vertical one. Oftentimes you might do, one thing you sometimes see is maybe on a landscape layout you might use a horizontal versus on a portrait you might use a vertical layout. So sometimes that layout changes based on the orientation of your font as well. But it has either of those options. Grid layout, if we want things to be laid out in a grid, one of the rules with the grid is there's kind of either a horizontal layout or a vertical layout. If you've got these arrayed, as I say, vertically, then all of the width of the items, they're on the same row, need to be the same width. They're going to be forced to be the same width. If it's arranged horizontally, it's a horizontal grid, then all of the columns have the same width. Versus then staggered, you can kind of do either the start from horizontal or start from vertical, but it doesn't enforce that everything on the same row or everything on the same column needs to be the same size. Okay. So this comes in if you have things, if you have elements that are, some of them are drastically bigger or smaller than others, then sometimes a staggered layout can be better. So for instance, we talk about Pinterest is where that one usually comes up. That's because all of the different images that are posted there are different aspect ratios. So that helps deal with that. So let's see how we do that. I'm going to go to the activity. Everything that we've done so far, I haven't actually touched the activity. So I need to go back to main activity and start wiring some of these other things up. Okay. So let's think about what we need. So in terms of views, I need to reference all of those views that I previously added to main activity. So I'm going to have an edit text for the movie title. Movie title input. I'm going to have a image button. So image button, add button. I have an error text. So private text view error text. Private RecyclerView movie list. Okay. So those are all the views that I added into the activities layout. Okay. So I got references to those. Also, in terms of how I'm going to store the state, I'm going to store the state, the movies in an array list. So I need array list movie. So that's my movies. I'll enter to import that movie class. Notice right now I'm not doing this with a view model. Okay, so I haven't added any view model or observe or live data stuff in yet. Okay. Also here, I want to go ahead and save a reference to the adapter. So movie list adapter. And even though I do have a layout manager that I also need to set up, I'm going to keep the layout manager as a local variable because I won't need to access it anywhere else. So this is kind of my state. My state is just the list plus the adapter. Okay. All right, let's get the views. So find views. I need to start from the top. So movie title input is find view by ID. r.id dot movie title input. Add button. Find view by ID. r.id dot add button. Error text is find view by ID. r.id dot error text. Last step is the movie list is find view by ID. r.id movie list. So gotten well acquainted with that, hopefully, in the projects that we've done. Now let's actually set up the adapter. So, or set up the RecyclerView. So first things first, I'm going to say movie list dot set layout manager, and we're going to set that to a new linear layout manager. Okay, so linear layout manager takes a few arguments to the constructor. It needs a context, so that's this. It's optional to include any of the remaining ones. So there's actually two constructors for linear layout manager. One that takes just a context, and that defaults, if I remember right, to a vertical orientation. But if you want to actually select which orientation it is, you do need to use that second constructor, which takes two arguments. So I'm going to push this down a little bit just to keep the code cleaner. So this linear layout manager dot vertical. So I can either select vertical or horizontal. And the last argument is, do you want it to be reversed or not reversed? And so in this case, I don't want to reverse it. I want it to be arranged from the first item to the last item. Now, why might it be that I want to reverse it? Well, a common case that comes up in terms of reversing it is sometimes you want the items that are added to the list to appear at the top instead of the bottom. So, for instance, a very common case for wanting to reverse that list is if you're doing any sort of chat application, where I may want to reverse it and put the newest messages in first, right? So I might display things backwards. Or let's say I've got new stories in, I might want to put the newest new story, maybe it comes to the end of the list, but I want it to be at the top of the list. So that flips everything so that the last item is displayed at the top and the first item is displayed at the bottom. So it's a really, really quick way to flip things just using the layout manager. So keep that in mind. Next thing I need to do is I need to set up the adapter. Okay, so adapter, let's say I say adapter is new movie list adapter. That needs to take the context and it needs to take a list. Now let's just say I pass in movie list. What's movie list right now, by the way?
Null, right?
It's null because I haven't given it a value yet. Okay, so this is kind of one of those areas where I don't want it to crash. So movie list dot set adapter, and I'm going to give it that adapter. Okay. Oh, this should be movies because that's the name of my array list. Okay, so let's start with that and just take a quick look at what we've got so far. A whole lot of nothing, right? Not because my code is wrong, but because there's still nothing in my list. Okay, but at least it didn't crash. It didn't crash because I had that null check in there. Okay, so one thing I got to remember to do is initialize list. So in terms of initializing the list, I need to populate it with movies. So movies, let's first create a new array list. One common mistake with initializing lists is to do it up here. You don't want to do any initialization up here because anything you do up here happens before onCreate. Any instant variables you allocate right away, they'll be before onCreate, and they will. There's no way to put a try-catch around them. So if anything goes wrong, your whole application crashes and you can't recover from it. So that's why I'm not saying new array list up there. I'm telling it to do it down here in onCreate so that I can debug it and resolve it if something happens and goes wrong with that process. Next up, I'm going to add some movies to it. So add a new movie. And maybe I just add 3 movies. Does anybody see a problem? Is there a problem with this code? It's a good question. You asked about the initial data. What were you saying? Yes. I have created the movie, but there's really no data in it. Okay. So how do I get the data into it?
Go back to the constructor, right?
Yeah, probably add a constructor here. So what I might want to do, oftentimes with my data classes, I need to make sure that there's what's called an empty constructor, a constructor that takes no arguments. If I don't add that one in there, then there'll only be the other constructor, and that can cause issues later. So I'm going to go ahead and add an empty constructor that just does nothing, plus a constructor that takes a title. So with your data classes, if you're going to add a constructor, do make sure that you add an empty constructor. It's a good convention. Next up, here I just need to say this.title is equal to title. So if I call this empty constructor, title will be null. If I call this constructor, then the title will be the title I've given it. Okay. So when I construct these now, I can give them names, right? So maybe I say matrix. Maybe I say matrix. What was the second one? Reloaded. And the third one, matrix. I think Revelations. Right, so I can populate some data in there, and let's see what effect that has. So I'm going to go and run the program with that in here. Okay, something happened. I see matrix. I see the first movie. What about the rest? They're not shown, right? They are. Remember that a recycler view, the whole point is to have a list that we can scroll through. There's a scroll bar here.
Right.
See that? There's a scroll bar. It's not immediately obvious because that scroll bar is hidden by default. But there actually is 3 items here. All 3 of the items are working. They're in the list. The problem is that my item layout is as tall as the screen. My item layout is as tall as the screen. So you only see the one item because it's so tall. What I need to do is get them to be shorter. Okay? And so how do I get them to be shorter? Well, I need to go back to the layout, back to the item movie layout, and specifically I need to pick the outer root node. that constraint layout. I need to pick whatever is at the root. Okay, at the root, what's the height of that? Match parent, which means it's as tall as the recycler view. So all of the items are as tall as the recycler view. So I want them to be as wide as the recycler view, but only as tall as they need to be. So I'm going to make their height wrap content. And as soon as their height is set to wrap content, then we get what we want. So that's a common mistake, is to forget to set the height of the element to wrap content. Now remember, it's backwards if we want to do this with a horizontal layout. So maybe I should try that real quick, is to see what would this look like with a horizontal layout. But let's try this here. So does that make sense so far? Very kind of following with the data. So that's how I'm setting these things up. A little thing just in terms of organization, I typically find that the adapter goes more with the list. So oftentimes I might set the adapter, create the adapter up here instead of further down. There's really no difference there. It just helps me in terms of organization, usually, to think about it that way. Cool? Questions? Okay. What's the next thing I need to do? Well, next thing I probably should do is hook it up so that I can add movies to the list, right? So I'm going to do that part next. So we've got it showing movies. I want to go to add movies. Also, looking at the time, it's probably a really good time to take a break. So let's go ahead and take a 15-minute break and come back at 2:40. We'll do the add part. Okay, so just to review kind of quick about what we've done so far, right? So I've got a quick list shown in the recycler view. As you can see, it takes a little bit of setup to get from data to actually being visible on the screen, right? So if you remember, what were some of the things I had to create in order to set the recycler view up? What was the first file I had to create? What additional file did I create first? The what? That was the second thing I created. Yep.
What is the adapter?
It was the third thing I created. So there were 3 files I had to add to my project. So the second one was the Viewholder. That was a class. The third one was the adapter class. But before I could even create the Viewholder, I had to create something else. The layout, right? So I had to create an item layout first. So general steps to remember. One of the first things you have to do is create that layout. You also have to create the Viewholder and then create the adapter. There's additional steps, obviously, in my process, but notice there's 3 additional files I had to add. 1 layout and two classes. That's all to support this. Okay. So the next thing I want to do is implement the logic to add movies, okay, to modify the list. And we'll see a few things along the way when I do that. So first things first, I need to hook that up for 2 different events, right? So one event, I want to add movies when you hit the plus button. I also want to be able to add movies from the go button here, the enter button. Okay, so I need both of those things to trigger the movie to be added. So I'm going to add 2 event listeners. So the first one is on the input. So movie title input, set editor action listener, and that's going to take view, action ID, and key event. Arrow. Good. Okay, so first when the user presses enter there, we need to do the operation there. So that needs to say add a movie, and we want to return false. Okay. If the user clicks on the button, so add button dot set on click listener view add movie. So I want to initiate that regardless of which of those two pathways the user goes through. Okay, so I'm going to declare both of those things there. They're both referring to an add movie button and a movie function that I haven't created yet. So private void add movie. So I can create that function so I can reuse it. I also, in that same process, I want to hide the keyboard through both of those pathways. So I'm going to grab my snippet, Android hide soft keyboard. There's the code that I want. Boop. And import all of the classes there. I think that can actually be context. Okay. Cool. So in both of those events, I want to hide the keyboard. So use the context and use the view that triggered it. Use the context and the view that triggered it. Okay. So now in terms of add movie, the first thing I want to do is get the user input. So that'd be the movie title is equal to movie title input dot get text dot toString. Now, a common little bit, remember generally we want to trim our inputs. So I might, in addition to that, add a quick trim just to trim any white space from the beginning and the end while I'm doing that. Okay. One common gotcha is usually if the user is entering data, well, they should fill something in, right? They should actually type in a title. So I do want to check that the user's actually typed something in. I don't want them to just enter blank and blank get added to the list. So I'm going to say if movie title, if its length is 0, then the user hasn't entered a title. So we want to go ahead and just show an error. So I might say error text dot set visibility, make sure it gets visible, view dot visible, and error text set text, and I might set it to please enter a title. Now you'll notice that's in yellow. Remember that being in yellow is warning me that I need to extract the string. One of the things I've seen on the labs is a lot of people forgot to extract your strings both from your Java and from your XML. So this is a common thing you need to make sure that you're doing is extracting this as well. So error movie title empty. Okay, so I'm going to add that in. And otherwise, everything's good. So we can proceed with what's there. I'm going to go ahead and return, just so I don't have to deal with the rest of the code being in an else statement. So I need to then add that to my list. So I'm going to say movies.add, and I need to add a new movie. and I'm going to use the movie title to construct that movie. Okay, so I'm using that to construct the movie, and let's just see what happens. So I should see, okay, if I don't type anything in. Let's type in test, hit plus. Okay. I'm actually surprised that it did show up, because it usually wouldn't show up.
How did it know?
It's a really good question. Now notice if I keep pressing it, it doesn't know. I think what happened is when the keyboard went away, yeah. So what happened was actually when the keyboard went away, it had a chance to re-render. And it picked it up at that point. It picked it up because of the keyboard coming and going.
But the keyboard going before that's new. Or I guess it's written that way.
It's during kind of the same time. Yeah. It's because of how things happen. I think that this process of hiding the keyboard is a little bit asynchronous. So it actually happens a little bit later, I think is what's happening, partially because of animations. So typically speaking, I do need to tell the RecyclerView some way. I need to tell it that there's actually been change to the underlying data, okay? Because usually it doesn't find that out, okay? The weird case there, it did find it out, but it usually won't do that. Another thing to notice there, notice that if I keep adding movies, that my error message doesn't go away, right? So I need to make sure, in this case, that I do get rid of that error message. So I want to say, towards the end, I might say error text dot set visible. I'm going to both hide it and maybe set it to blank. So hide it and clear out the text that's there. Okay. So typically what I need to do is I need to tell the RecyclerView that there's a new way, that there's new data. So one way you can do that is you can say, well, let's just create a new adapter. So if I create a new adapter equals new movie list adapter, this movies, and then say RecyclerView or movie list dot set adapter, and give it that new adapter. Well, new adapter starts completely from scratch, and so anytime it gets a new adapter, that will cause it to update, right? That's one way you can do things. So I can type in test, add it, and you can see it keeps getting added. So that much is working, right? So one way I can do that is I can create a new adapter every time. Okay. Now, watch what happens when I hit plus. I'm scrolled down to the bottom here. Okay. Scroll down to the bottom of the list. I'm going to hit plus. Notice it scrolled me to the top of the list. Okay. Anytime you replace the adapter, it scrolls to the beginning of the list. Anytime you replace the adapter, it will scroll to the beginning of the list. So we typically want to avoid creating a new adapter for that very reason. We want to avoid it scrolling on the user. We want it to stay where it is. Okay. So in order for it to stay where it is, we have to keep the same adapter. So if you're hearing me with that? So I typically want to avoid that unless I really, really need to replace it with something new. Like let's say you're getting new search results, that might be okay, right? You might say, okay, we've got brand new search results. We might as well just throw everything away and start over. But it's also pretty costly because it has to recreate everything. If you create a new adapter, it has to throw away all of those view holders and all those views and everything and recreate it back up from scratch. So I'd like to tell it that there's new data, okay? Well, there is a method. There is a method. So rather than creating a new adapter, one thing I can do is I can say there's a method on here. I forget what the name was. Notify dataset changed. So I can call notify dataset changed to tell it that there's new data. And you can see there it updates every time. But it doesn't scroll me back to the beginning of the list. It keeps me where I'm at in that process. Right? So that's helpful, right? It's helpful for it to be not changing where the user is located. Now, you might notice on here that there's a little bit of an error or a little bit of a warning that is saying you might want to specify something more specific about how the data changed. Because notify dataset changed, this method just says the entire dataset changed. Assume everything changed. But we know how the data changed. How did the data change? Well, we added an item. So this is one way you can do it. That just says, that says it has to refigure everything out. So it's sometimes a little bit more efficient to tell it just what changed. Now, this isn't always true. There are plenty of cases where it's faster to just tell it all the data changed. Sometimes that is faster than telling it how it changed. But here we can say notify item inserted. So because an item was just inserted, I can say it was inserted at movies.size -1 is the position of the new item, because I know it's the last item in the list, which would be size -1 or length -1, if you don't think about it that way. So test. Oh, I think I crashed something. Where did I crash? It'll work this time. Oh, because it was updating so fast. So the gotcha is when I hit here, it actually got 2 events. Okay, and it didn't work. So if I hit enter on my keyboard, that's where it's becoming weird. So that is related to my editor action listener. So one thing that I sometimes have to do is play around with that. I'm going to go back to notify dataset changed. Just tell it the whole thing changed, because that did not cause that problem. Test. Or oh, it did. It did. Well, why does pressing enter on my keyboard cause it to freeze like that? It doesn't seem to do that when I hit the arrow, but enter seems to be behaving a little bit weird. That is interesting. I'm not sure what's going on there. Yeah, it's turning this gray if I hit enter on the keyboard. Okay, but it still seems like it's working. It seemed like it froze when I did the other way. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it was just my perception. Oh, it didn't freeze. It's just changing what's focused. So one thing I might want to do, because it's changing this RecyclerView to be focused, when I hit enter there, I might want to put the focus back into that field. So one thing I might want to do is go movie title dot request focus. Is that it? Or no, movie title input. Movie title input dot request focus. So put the focus back to it. And also while I'm here, I want to go ahead and select all the text that I just entered. So set selection 0 to movie title input dot get text. Doop. Dot length. So that's going to tell it to select all of the text that's in there. So if I type in test and enter, there it put focus on there. Now it's interesting that it still put the gray down here. So I'm not sure what's going on there. So that should have focused. You can see as soon as I click back onto it that it's immediately got all the text selected. But something interesting is happening, obviously, with focus, and I don't know what exactly the story is there. So test, enter, yeah. You see it briefly, like you can see that it's selecting all of that, but it seems almost as soon as I tap in there that it's losing the selection because of the keyboard popping back up. Yeah, works with the button. So I'm not entirely sure what I'm missing with the editor action listener. My guess is
something about pressing the enter button leads to a new focus, right?
Yeah, something there. So what I may want to do in here is I might want to put a quick if statement, say if there's a key event is not null, and if that key event, so I can ask if there's a key event and that key code is enter. I believe sometimes I have to treat that a little bit specially. So enter. Oh, I need to do, that's the wrong constant. It's key code, enter. There. So key code, enter, and then I think I need to return true to tell it to stop doing its default behavior. I think that default behavior is what's causing the problem. So if I go in here, yes, that's what it was. So the default behavior is part of what was causing it to kind of gray this out, switch focus, all those kind of things. That's what I needed to prevent. Test.
Well,
that's interesting. Okay, so notice what the icon is. The icon's this little arrow. So that icon is the next key. So what that key is doing is pushing it to the next element, which actually would be like the button. So I actually need to change that there. So in the layout for main activity, I need to go to the input and say IME options and say action done. That'll change what key is on the keyboard. See this one? Check mark instead of the arrow. Now that's interesting because it didn't do the selection. So
it did do it with the arrow.
it did. I think it did. So that's an interesting thing there. What happens if I try go? Yes?
You're not selecting the key code, so the key code is not.
Yes, there's a reason for that. That worked. So apparently go and done behave differently. Yeah, so apparently go and done behave differently, which is weird. So what I was doing with the key event is it turns out that this key event isn't sent all the time. So if I put enter on the physical keyboard, I'll just get a single event with the key event. But if I press that go key, if I press this on the keyboard, then it will actually send me two events. The first event is without a key event and the action ID of go. And then the second one is with the enter key, which is with the key event. So it actually fires two. And so that first one doesn't have a key event. And so it would crash without that. That was one thing I think I troubleshooted with Brandon, and we kind of figured that out. So that's what I've got to do there to make it stop doing the weird behavior that's going on. What? What were you saying?
So where would you go to find out that it sends out two events?
Testing?
We have to log in.
Yeah, we had to literally log it and troubleshoot it to figure that out. So we had to troubleshoot it and just see what was going on because he was seeing some weird behavior.
So you throw a log in there and it would show twice.
I did a log.i. What I did in here, I can do it real quick. Log I main activity, and we said actually I think I just set action ID here. Action ID plus, and we just logged what the action ID was, and we found that that was logged twice, basically, is what we had found. And so I found when I pressed the button on the keyboard that I got two log messages then, rather than just one. So this fires only off of the second event instead of the first one. Okay, so problem resolved there. What else did I need to do? I probably want to see. So we're adding it, it's updating, that's all good. Okay. So oftentimes I may not want to directly worry about invoking these adapter methods. And I thought historically that they were more protected, but maybe not. So oftentimes I might not do it here directly this way. Oftentimes I might do at least one part of this. I might do sometimes in an adapter. I think I'm going to leave that there though for the moment. The key thing to remember, the key thing to notice there is in order for it to recognize that there's a change, is that I have to notify it in some way, shape, or form. That's the important thing to realize, is that anytime you make a change to the list, I have to tell the adapter how the list changed. Okay, so I can either say everything changed like this, or I could say, hey, just a single item's been added at this position. There's also an option for moving, and there's an option for removing as well. So one of the requirements that I had given you is that specifically that it should limit it to 10 items, right? So we said, hey, if the list grows to that length, so if the movies array dot length or dot size, if that becomes greater than 10, then I wanted to remove the oldest thing. So I want to say movies dot remove, and I remove index 0 because that was the oldest item. Okay, I'm going to cycle that one out. In this case, I now need to also tell the adapter that that item's been removed. Notify item removed at index 0. The order of those is important. You need to make sure that you change the data, change the list, and then notify the adapter. If you don't do it in that order, you're going to see things behave really squirrely. Because when it's got that notification, it's presuming that the change has already been made. And so it will update the wrong way if you do those things out of order. So checking that real quick. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Well, that's interesting. Where are they doubled? That's a good question. I think it's simply based on how long I hold the key down. So if I hold the key down long enough, notice it keeps adding things.
So you need to change the key sensitivity in Windows?
Well, what I probably need to do then in that case is I'm probably going to actually have to clear out what the user typed in. So I'm probably going to have to clear out the text that's typed in so that the second time it gives an error instead of adding it. So I think that's the best workaround for that. That might be less of an issue if I was doing it with the soft keyboard. Maybe part of it may be just because I was doing the physical keyboard. So let's just try that again. So 1, 2. Oh, of course it's not a number keyboard because it's movie titles. 5, 6, 7. And we can see, there we go. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to do. And you can see there's some automation, automatically some animations in there because it already animates. As you tell it, if items have been removed and added, it will animate the same thing. Cool. Questions? Make sense? As I mentioned before, one thing to notice is I haven't added a scroll view to this because I only want one thing to scroll in here, which is the recycler view. Okay. Any questions with it so far? You understand what we're doing? Notice I don't need to use a string builder to rebuild things because I'm having that adapter render it as actual views. One of the nice things that this lets me do is now, because it's not just a text view, I can add additional components to this layout, such as I could add a component to maybe remove it from the list. So like if I wanted a button to remove a movie from my list, I can do that. I couldn't do that before with just a text view. So let's say I want to do that. Let's say I want to add some sort of delete button. I might go add another icon, another vector asset, and call this, say, trash. There it is. It's called delete. Okay. So delete. I see delete. Next. Finish. And I want to, on my movie layout, I want to adjust the layout a little bit So I'm going to get rid of the constraint here, and I'm going to add in a button. So I've got a little image button that goes in here. That's going to be my trash can. I might want to make that color the background tint. Let's go for our error color. And let's anchor that over here. And then I'm going to anchor that back to here. Cool. I think that those are a little bit different in height. I'm going to just leave it as is though. Okay, so I've got a delete button there, and I need to name that. So it'd be item movie delete. So if I add something additional to the layout here, right, where's the next place I need to update? If I add something additional to the layout, where's the item layout, where's the next file that we need to update? The Viewholder class, right? So, because remember the Viewholder is directly based on that layout. So in here, public image button, this would be delete. Okay, so I'm going to add that there. Where's the next place where we need to update? Adapter. Okay, so in the adapter, I'm going to go into Oncreateviewholder, vh.delete is equal to itemView.findViewById r.id.item movie delete. Right? So I can go there, I can hook up the delete button. Okay. Now, where do I hook up the onClick listener?
In the Viewholder class?
I would say I probably don't want to do it in the Viewholder class. I would prefer to keep that in. So I want to do it somewhere in the adapter. Okay. Okay. So on bind. The reason I ask is because you can do it in either one of these. Right. It's possible to hook up the onClick listener on create versus on bind. It can be done either way. Why does it matter? How often is on bind Viewholder called? How often is it called?
Every time that the
Data.
data set changes.
Yeah, anytime there's new data that we need to render, even as the user is scrolling up and down, if they're scrolling up and down through a long list, that's continuously being called. When is Oncreateviewholder called? Only at the beginning, right? So Oncreateviewholder is called a very, very small number of times, assuming I'm reusing that adapter, versus onBindViewholder is called a lot, okay? So if I care about the frequency, it's going to be a lot more efficient to hook it up here than to hook it up down here, okay? So it's a lot faster to do it here rather than here. However, I know what item it's being bound to here. I know the data. Here I don't know the data. I know what item you're binding to. Here I don't know what item you're binding to. So that throws a little bit of a conundrum, right? Sometimes, you know, sometimes one of the gotchas there is it may be that you need to hook up a different listener depending on the data. So it may be that those buttons behave differently based on the kind of data that's there. And so you may have, that way be one reason why you're forced to put it down here is because you need to know the data first. But I would like to do it up here if I can. Okay. So let's try. VH So register listeners vh.delete.set on click listener. That takes a view, and maybe I can do a quick toast dot make text. This is one of those reasons where I might want the context, and I need to show some text, and let's just show that for a short duration. So let's just say we want to show a toast when the user clicks on that delete button. Okay, so you can see we got a delete button for every item, and that toast does appear. Okay, so the next question is, how do I know what item to delete, and how do I initiate that process? Okay, so one gotcha is, can I make the change to the list here? Can I make the change to the list here? Can I remove the item? In this clip. Can I remove the item here? What happens if I say items.remove, and notice that on a list that there's two remove methods. There's one that takes an index and there's one that takes an object. Does everybody see that? One that takes an index and one that takes an object. Okay, so I can say either remove it by the index, the position where it is in the list, or I can remove it by the actual instance of it. Removing it by index is always faster. Removing it by index is always faster. The reason is it doesn't have to search for which item you want to remove. If you use the version that takes an object, it has to iterate, scan through the list, and find an object that equals it. It actually will use the equals method in that iteration. Which you might notice on my movie, I haven't actually implemented the equals method. So it would be using a default implementation which just compares references. So that doesn't always work as obviously as you might think. Sometimes you have to implement equals to make remove work. Okay. Now, I could remove it if I knew the index. So I could say, for instance, if I say remove index 0, right, that would remove the first item. All right. Nothing happened.
Well, we haven't told it that we've made a change, right?
Yes, I haven't told it that I made a change. So I also need to say notify item removed, and I need to say item 0. Now notice this version, the notification has to have an index. So we might as well use the index for both of those to make sure we're getting the same index. Because if I go the other route, compare it by equals, I might remove it from one index and then notify that it's been removed from a different index. So I need to pass the index for both of those. So let's try that again. If I try to delete the first one, gone, gone, gone. Okay. Now remember, I'm just telling it to remove the first one. So regardless of what button I click, it's always removing the first one. Okay. So here's the trick. If I remember right, on the Viewholder itself, I can say vh dot this get adapter position. That tells you which item is it currently bound to in the adapter. So it's currently bound to whatever index. That's the index I need. So int index is take the view holder, get the adapter position, and pass that index to both of these calls. So if I wire that up, it deletes the right movie.
Okay.
That's cool. That works. Okay.
What does that mean, adapter position?
It's position in the adapter. Think of it as the position in the list. But remember, adapter doesn't have to be a list. It doesn't have to be backed by a list. So that's why it's get adapter position instead of get list position. Make sense? So, are there any problems with that? It works. What if I need to persist that somewhere? Right? Right now, that data just kind of goes away if I leave the app and come back, right? But what happens if I need to let a web service know that it's been changed, or I need to update a file, I need to make a database request? That's a bit of a problem, right? Because this should know about that detail, right? Whatever we put into this adapter should not know how the data is being stored, right? But all this is doing is changing it in memory. And so there's no way really for the storage mechanism to get that notice and be updated. Does that make sense? So typically, we may not want to do it this way. We may want to relegate that logic, relegate the job of actually removing it to somewhere else, right? Usually the data layer, right? Usually the data layer. Okay, so this does work in this narrow scenario, but it's not usually what I would do to remove something, because I usually need to let the data layer know, and then the data layer might decide, oh, you can't delete that, or it's already deleted. Whatever the case is, it usually needs to be called first before I update the UI. So that's one thing. I think I may go ahead though next, and let's talk about the architecture component side of things, right? So we started to set up part of the architecture, right? I've got a data layer, I've got a UI layer, but I haven't added a view model, right? So, and that's kind of where we're going, right? We want to be doing our exercises, our examples, our code, our projects where we have a lot less code in main activity. Because I've kind of gone back to that style where main activity is doing most of the work. See that? Main activity is doing most of the work. So I need to get out of that mode. I need to get into the mode where the view model is taking care of our business logic. Okay. So I'm going to add a new class into the UI layer, and this is going to be my view model. Okay. What do we want to call this? Maybe I'm going to call this movie list view model. Okay. And that extends view model. I'm just going to say this extends a view model. Okay. Remember, one of the things I needed to do in here is I needed to have a bunch of mutable live data that are capturing the current state of the application. Okay? So if we're thinking about the UI, what state is there to the UI? How can I describe the state of the front end? I might note here, if I add a movie and turn this sideways, remember all my data is lost, right? Because the activity goes away and comes back. So also adding a view model will avoid that problem. Okay. But what data do we have? What data are we trying to keep?
What's in the text box?
Text box? Okay. So you've got what's in the edit text is one thing as far as the UI is concerned. What else do we want? I've got a list, right? So I've got where's in the edit box. I've got this list, and I've also got potentially an error message. So those are the three pieces of state that I have right now. So that's what I'm going to capture. So I'm going to say, let's do private, private, mutable live data, and I might say movie title, or string. So this is the movie title input. That's what the user is currently typing in. Private, mutable live data string, and we've got the error text, private mutable live data array list, movie and this is the movies. So that's really captures the entire state of the application, right? Now, there's one thing I would maybe recommend. This input right here. If I'm going to keep this in sync with what's on the front end, how often do I need to update that?
Every keystroke.
Every keystroke, right? I could do that. I could wire that up, but I really don't need to. I really don't need to. That is a piece of data that I would try to preserve a different way, and maybe not in the view model. I could be wrong with that, and there might be some reason to do that, but I don't think that we need to keep that in the view model, suffice to say. Okay? Because one interesting thing I might show you, if I type in test here and turn it sideways, notice the test is still there. Okay? So data in edit text is actually preserved a different way. It's preserved using something called instance state. Saved instance state. So I actually don't need to preserve that for rotation, right? It's kind of a different story how that data is concerned. Okay, so I need a constructor, public movie list view model, and I'm going to say error text is equal to new movie live data. No. Now, one little thing you might notice as I type that out, notice that I didn't have to put in the generic part here, where I just have a part greater than and less than signs, versus up here I had to do string. It used to be, starting with Java 5.0, that I had to type in the keyword string here. But with newer versions of Java, what's happened is that it can automatically figure those things out. So it used to be that I had to type the same type both places. But that leads to things being pretty long, especially when you have things like this. Mutable live data, array list, movie, and it can get longer than that because you can get a lot of generic type arguments. So it's really just a shorthand because it's figuring it out what should be here based on what's on the left side of the equals. That's what's happening, is it's figuring it out from the left side. Which really surprised me the first time I saw it. It's like, what? I don't have to include that? And so for movies, we're also going to start that at null. Or maybe not. Maybe I shouldn't start that at null. Maybe I should create my movie list here. So I need to create that list because I need to move it into here. So beep. Maybe I call that my movie list. And pass that in as that initial value. So maybe I just initialize that in the constructor. So that's our data, right? Was there anything else I needed to add to this view model? So I have my live data. I have a constructor. Is there anything else I need to add? Let's start hooking this up. Do you remember what else was in the view model? Cody? Do you remember what else was in the view model? Danny? The what? Not what I'm thinking of, right? So I've got instance fields, I've got a constructor. Usually what would follow would be methods, right? So what methods do I need to add to this? Getters, yes. So that's the next thing. So public live data. So I need to add some getters for both of these two pieces. So public string get error text. And this should return the error text live data. Import the class. And I need another getter for the movies. Get movies. Right. So this is containing both of those live datas now. Okay. Last thing I need in here, public void add movie. So I need any logic, right, that modifies the data to also be contained here, right? So if I want to make a change to that list, it needs to go through here, okay? So let's say I want to add a movie. Okay, well, I need to know the title of that movie. So string movie title. What I know is I do need to kind of pull over the logic that we had from here. So for instance, things like, oh, if it's blank, then I need to immediately return and immediately show an error. So I'm going to say if movie title dot length is 0, then we're just going to not update the list. I'll just say error text dot post value, and we'll post that message. So I need to post the message there. So string message. Oh, but I can't get that. Okay. Because I didn't do the other thing. So title is blank. I'm just going to hard code the message in there for now. Otherwise, error text dot post value, there'd be no error, but I would want to go and add it to the list. Now, remember that movies is a mutable live data, right? It is not the list itself. So I can't immediately modify that list. I need to pull it out of the live data. So I'm going to start with get value. So this is going to give me an array list of movies, and so I pull that out, and then I can add in my movie. So new movie title. That's good, right? List has been updated. But does anybody know about it? Nobody knows that things have been changed, right? So how do I tell the rest of my code that there's been a change to the live data? Observe it, but there's no event happening to observe, right? This add does not trigger an event. So I have to make sure that an event gets created, gets posted. So I have to make sure that I say movies dot post value. I have to do some sort of post value to make sure that it actually knows that there's new data. Okay. So if I'm using this live data, this view model, and this live data, I need to make sure that that post value gets called so that the observer gets notified. Cool. Is there any other logic I need to do in here? All right, so we got a view model. View model is not hooked up. So back to here, I need to have a reference to that view model, right? So in here, we need to say, hey, private movie list view model. That's my model. And I'm going to get that in the constructor. Now I'm going to use a little bit of a different technique that was from the reading material. So I'm going to say new view model provider. I need to pass in this, and then .get, tell it what kind of class I want. So I want a movie list view model .class. So I'm going to construct my view model that way. Okay. Now, question. What of this code should be here, and what of this code should be not here? Should the activity own the list? Okay, so you're shaking your head. Why? Probably be the data package, but specifically, who owns the list now? It's not the activity, it's the view model, right? The view model owns that. So I don't want to be storing that in two places. I don't want to have a list here that is the list of movies, as well as having a list over here that's also the list of movies. It has to be just one place. So that means I need to remove this list entirely. That variable needs to go away completely. Okay, so I don't want to even have a reference to movies anymore. So that means all this stuff is going to go away. That means when I construct the adapter, I'm just going to pass in null. I won't pass in the movie list. And when I deal with the event down here, I obviously don't have access to that. Okay. So let me comment out what's in the add method right now, and we'll come back to this. Okay. So when we add a movie, I definitely want to call model.addMovie and pass in the movie title. So what? Okay. So that's part of what, like, this is ideally what I'd like to have here. I may need to have some additional code, depending, to accomplish some of these other things that we were doing. But that's kind of what I'm going for. Okay? I just want to be able to tell the model that there is this happen, and I want the UI to update accordingly. Okay? But if I start there, what did I? Line. Oh, yes. Yes. I do need the closing curly brace. So if I walk back to that, nothing appears to happen because I'm not observing anything yet, right? I'm not observing any changes to that. So I do need to make sure that I observe the various parts of that model. So I might want to say model.observe or get error text .observe, and I say here maybe message, and so I'm going to say let's update our error text. So error text .set visibility. So if there is a message, then it's visible, otherwise it's not. And set the text to that message. Okay. What did I miss? Missing return statement. Why does it think I need a return? I don't believe I need to do that. Was there anything we had to add in terms of? Oh, I know what's missing. Let me pass this. I forgot to pass the owner the context as the first argument. That's why. I'm like, this is not working. So I want to set that, and I also want to observe the other part, which is the movie list. Observe this, and movies, arrow. Okay, so if the movie list changes, then I need to let the adapter know about it. So I need to say, in some way, shape, or form, I need to tell it that there is a new list. Okay, so oftentimes I find myself for purposes like this, I often find myself adding to the adapter some sort of setter to provide the updated data. And so the way that that looks is I would go up here, public void set items, and it's going to take that list of movies, and I'm just going to say this dot movies is movies, and also notify dataset changed at the same time. Oh, that should be items. So I might say, oh, okay, if we get a new list, we're going to call this cell, and that's going to make both of those things happen. Save the new list and notify that the data set has changed. So I often find myself needing to add that, and then this works. Okay, so let's give this a try. So we can see, okay, there's my data. That works. So I can add things again. But I've lost all the other nicety that I had about dealing with selecting or removing what's there. So I still have some stuff that I kind of have to re-implement in some sense because that's not happening anymore. Other things I need to do, let's see what happens if I leave it blank. That works. That works. Okay. Now, one thing to think about, what happens if I click this button? Okay. So the UI updated, but there's their problem. Remember in my adapter, I just told it to directly change this list and then, well, update the screen. Part of the problem here now is that we're changing something we don't really own, right? The view model owns it. So does the view model know to update its observers when this happens? If we had anything else observing it, there wouldn't be an event through that observer. You hear me? So I need to kind of pipe that through, and who should actually be in charge of removing it? Who owns it? Who's taking care of adding? The view model, right? So also by the same token, the view model should be in charge of removing it. So if we wanted to do that, I need to go over here, public void, remove movie. What does it need to take as an input? An index? Yeah. Yep. So we need an index. And in terms of what I want to do here, it's kind of a similar story. I want to say get the movie, get the list, list.remove that index, and then movies.post value, and I'm going to post that there's a change to the list, which then would circle back, go to the observer notifies the adapter that there's updated data. So rather than the adapter changing the data directly, I want to kind of do it indirectly. Okay? So it needs to get to a point where it calls this method. Okay. How can I accomplish that? How can I have, when I click on it, right, I want to call this method over in the view model.
Is the view model public?
Who owns the view model? Who owns the view model? Which class? Right? In some sense, it's Android that owns the view model, right? But the one that has a reference to it is the activity, right? The activity owns a reference to it. Do we have a reference to that activity? Do we have a reference to the view model from here? I don't really have a reference to the view model, right? And I don't really, in some sense, have a reference to the activity. I have a reference to activity as a base, but I don't want to presume that it is main activity. It might be some other activity. So I can't say that I really necessarily have access to the view model. I don't necessarily have access to the view model.
Static method or something?
One thing I will say is you want to avoid static methods like the plague. You could try to implement this fix it with a static method. You're going to create more problems because eventually you have to get rid of that static method. So take that off the table. If it requires a static method, then you don't want to do it. What are my options? What are my options?
Make a new instance of the view model.
Okay.
And then.
But if I make a new instance of the view model, that's not the same instance that I'm observing.
No,
right? I need to have the same instance that the activity is using. Okay. So I really think it boils down to kind of two options. One option is that I can pass the view model down to the constructor of the adapter. That's one option, is I could pass it down to the constructor of the adapter. Another option I could use is, notice how I'm getting the view model here. New view model provider, this, get the new list view class. Turns out I actually have the this here, so I could actually in this case, I could actually use this again. I can use the new model provider to actually end up with the same view. That I could actually do. Okay. But I'm going to go down the route of passing it to the constructor to make sure that I get the same one. So I'm going to add it as another argument here, private, and I'm going to say this is the movie list view model. And I'm actually going to then accept it as an argument. And so here, this dot model is equal to model. Now there's an interesting thing that happens here. If I get the whole view model, I actually don't need the list. I technically don't, because I can get it from the model itself. So I don't anymore, if I take the entire model, I actually don't need that to be passed in the constructor, because I can just say model. I can actually just start it as null. That's fine. I can just start it as null. And what I can do is I could actually go so far as maybe even hooking up the observer in here, right? I could go that far and say, oh, well, maybe we'll just start observing from the adapter. Maybe that could even take care of it. So maybe I could just say model dot get movies dot observe. I can pass in the context. I do have access to that. And I could say model, I could say when we get that, so movies set items to movies. So I could even set up the observation here. Now, cannot cast first. Oh, okay. Yes, let me come back to that. So one of the things that means is I don't need to do the observation. If I do it this way, I don't need to do the observation up here. And I would just need to pass the model down. Okay, so I pass the model down, and I'm not observing the movies up here. This says that I can't cast it to a lifecycle owner. Okay, an activity is a lifecycle owner, but there's a weirdness kind of to the hierarchy. So app compat activity is a lifecycle owner, but activity itself is not a lifecycle owner. So it actually comes in as part of this app compat activity, which means that I need to switch this over to that. To be app compat activity instead of just activity. Okay, that's one problem down. Next things is here, rather than doing that logic, what I want to do is say model dot remove movie and pass in the index. So I'm going through the model now instead of going directly to change the data. Which works. Which but has one problem that I still don't know how to solve. In that, because this now triggers that the whole list has changed, the animations are broken. Because it doesn't know anymore that the item which index has been removed. I don't know a good way around that using the view model stuff. I don't know if there's a good way to get that animation to work. Suffices. There's probably some way that I'm not thinking of, but we would effectively need to know what change was made, right? And I don't know that there's a way to do that from what I'm aware of. So it works without the animation. It does remove it. Okay. So you're kind of seeing how you can start to wire this up to the model. So. Questions? Because of the time we have allowed, I'm going to leave this part of how do you do the other parts, maybe as an exercise for you to kind of think about, how can I get some of the stuff back in, right? Although maybe I can get through it quick. Maybe I can get through it quick. So this stuff here, I know I can move that easy. I know I can move the limit part pretty easy. So I can just say if the list is big, then remove the first. I can move that over. And thinking about other things I need to do in here, I wanted to make sure that I think that's all I need to bring over. It's just those last few lines. is just request the focus, set the selection, and maybe clear it out. I think if I do that, then I may have back to where I was. Yes. Yeah, so that gets me back to where I needed to be. Okay. Questions? Starting to put you in the right place for maybe working through the eBay process that you're working with, hopefully. Okay, I'm gonna save this all. I'm gonna push it up. That is pushed. So you can get all of that example code under that public repository, same place where the eBay auth and the other the news reader apps are. So that's all up there.